Thank you all for coming to our town hall meeting. This is one of our district-wide town halls. Remember that we do four quarterly town halls around the four sort of corners or quadrants of our district, and then we try to do two district-wide town halls each year. So this is one of those. So thank you all for coming. I want to give a huge shout out to Mayfield for having us here. It's a beautiful campus since the work that they've done. And so Kate Moran, the head of school, and Connie Peters, the head of operations, we want to thank you very much for having us here. So we've been very busy at City Hall as usual, and I'll talk later about some of the specific things that we've been working on. We have some special guests, so I want to get to them. Before we do that, I just want to note, I was sort of noodling around, and the Olympics were the last 2 weeks, the Winter Olympics. And you may not know, but we had two young ladies with strong Pasadena connections in the Olympics on the U.S. team, and they both medaled in the U.S. Olympics. And so I'm talking, of course, about Mirai Nagasu, the figure skater, who, since she was this big, has been skating at our rink in the Civic Auditorium there, our ice rink. She still skates there. She is still trained and coached there. This was her second Olympics, I believe, and she won a bronze medal in the team skate, and she did, for the first time ever in the Olympics, she did something called a triple axel. Not exactly sure what that is, but it was, apparently it's very difficult and unprecedented, and she did that. And then, in a way a little closer to home, a young lady named Lauren Gibbs, who attended Westridge School before going off to college in the East, and whose mom is the executive director of the Senior Center, Akila Gibbs. Lauren was on the two-person women's bobsled team, and they won a silver medal at the Olympics. And I think it's very exciting. I don't know who else would do this, but I sat and counted up the number of individual people from the U.S. team who won medals, because, for example, the women's hockey team won the gold medal, and I think they must be 20 or 25. And then there were some others, some skiers who won multiple medals. So you have to be careful not to double count. But by my count, there were 59 American individual athletes who came home from Pyeongchang with a medal. And 2 of the 59 were from little old Pasadena. So I think that's really great. Yeah, bravo. I'm hoping we can prevail on one or both of those medalists to come to City Hall and be recognized at a meeting, but I imagine they're pretty busy right now with perhaps more lucrative endeavors. So I think the sort of premier thing that we wanted to do tonight is to have our friends Bill Bogart and Doug Cranwinkle talk about something I'm very excited by. I hope you will be excited by as well. It's the work of the One Arroyo group, as we call it, and I'll let Bill and Doug describe it in more detail, but it's, I think, the idea of taking a fresh, holistic look at the Arroyo Seco, a very important part of Pasadena, an important part of our district, given that 2/3 of it, in whole or in part, are in our city council district. And, Bill and Doug, obviously, we'd be here all night just talking about their contributions to Pasadena if I tried to do that. So you know who they are, you know how great they are, and I'd like you to welcome Bill Bogart and Doug Cranwinkle. Thank you. You okay if I leave that?
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much, Steve, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to present to you the progress that the Arroyo Advisory Group has made since about a year ago. Doug Cranwinkle and I, as co-chairs, are here to give you an update on what's happened during the last 12 months since we made our inaugural presentation 1 year ago on this very campus, but in the facility across the street. Some of you might have been here for that. I can tell you in the 12 months since then, it's been an exciting time and also exhausting. A lot of work has gone on, and we hope that you're favorably disposed toward the direction that we're going and will continue to take an interest in this effort. The Arroyo Advisory Group was formed by approval of the City Council based on a recommendation of about 20 persons made by the city manager, Stephen Mermel, and Darrell Dunn, the general manager of the Rose Bowl. We were called upon to address the needs of the Arroyo, to make recommendations, and to find new sources of funding to supplement the money that is available in a very tight municipal budget for maintenance and repair in the Arroyo Seco. If someone might ask, why fuss with the Arroyo at this point in time, there's a litany of reasons why that's important, but let me simply say that about 15 years ago, we approved 3 master plans, one for the Upper Arroyo or Cajamonga, one for the Central Arroyo, one for the Lower Arroyo. And those plans, which were the subject of intense study, public hearings, environmental impact reports, and council approval, have only marginally been implemented since then for the lack of funding. So there's a whole litany of opportunities for the Arroyo Seco that are set forth in those master plans. And our effort has been largely in the context of those master plans, taking a fresh look at the projects to see if we can't break through the existing limitations on funding and achieve what some have called a new paradigm in the funding of the Arroyo Seco. Slide. The committee was formed, as I say, a year ago, and we broke up into 4 committees. The first committee is community outreach and engagement, outreach to the community to hear back about what the Arroyo Seco, what the people of this community and this region want for the Arroyo has been a priority. And the WPRA meeting that I referred to 1 year ago was replicated on many occasions in the course of the year. There were other outreach efforts that I'll talk about in a moment. Second committee mentioned on the slide is projects and priorities. It is chaired by Tom Seifert, the chair of the Arroyo Seco Foundation and active in many ways, other ways in the community. It was his committee that looked at the various possibilities for improvements and projects in the Arroyo Seco based primarily on the master plans, and has helped us see those priorities in a new light and with a different order. Financial planning is headed by Dan Rothenberg, a resident of District 6. Tom is a resident of District 6, just because this meeting is sponsored by Councilmember Madison. That committee has looked at what the existing funding arrangements are, what the revenues have been in the Arroyo Seco, what possibilities there are for grants from the county and the state level. And I would say that at this point in the history of the Arroyo Seco, in the history of this effort, the Financial Planning Committee is going to the fore. It's in the spotlight to really perform over the months ahead with respect to the funding aspects of this need. Slide. The fourth committee that we formed was the Vision Statement Committee. It's chaired by Sue Mossman, and they were the first committee to come up with a product. This was done almost a year ago. It's a tentative statement of the vision that we have formulated to inspire ourselves and all of the community about the future of the Arroyo Seco. I would say that the concept has developed that the Arroyo shouldn't be viewed as 3 separate areas of the city, 3 separate areas of that natural park, but should be thought of and perceived in the community as one Arroyo, and you'll hear that theme come back time and again. This slide represents a summary of the work that was done by projects and priorities, looking at the various needs of the Arroyo Seco, the various assets, the condition of things, and it was in that context that the notion of having a one Arroyo theme to pursue has emerged. Slide. In addition to the One Arroyo, which I'll take a few more minutes on in a second, there are other priorities and projects that Tom Seifert's committee has identified, and they relate to the restoration of the natural stream bed and the other items that are set forth there, which I won't repeat in the interest of time. The project prioritization is an ongoing process. We expect that it will continue and be refined as funding becomes available. But the principal project that we're focusing on at the present time, slide, is the One Arroyo Trail. No. We do have a poster that shows the arroyo from well above, in the forests, well above JPL, through Hahamunga, through the Central Arroyo, the golf course and the Rose Bowl, and then into the lower arroyo to the boundary of South Pasadena. It's about 900 acres, interestingly larger than Central Park. Central Park, we understand, is about 800. Central Park in New York City is about 850 acres. So we have something precious here that we have a challenge and an opportunity in the years ahead to spotlight and to improve for the benefit of ourselves and future generations. I wanted to mention that the questions come up as we talk about the Arroyo Advisory Group is what are our views about the future of the golf course? And that gives me an opportunity to draw a distinction between our charter, which relates to the Arroyo Seco and the breadth that I've described it, the length and breadth I've described it, and the work and the jurisdiction of the Rose Bowl Operating Company, which is a nonprofit organization sponsored by the city and which has been managing for many years the Rose Bowl and the golf course. Those enterprises are going forward under the direction of the Rose Bowl Operating Company and the general manager, and are not directly a responsibility for us. I would say that the RBOC has been a very supportive and constructive partner in our efforts so far, and we expect that partnership between the Rose Bowl Operating Company and the One Arroyo movement that we're talking about tonight, we expect that cooperation to continue. Slide. Go back one. What this slide presents is, in addition to announcing that we have a concept plan for the Arroyo Seco, for the trail, it would be a 22-mile trail on the banks along the arroyo on the west side and on the east side. Recognizing the cost of that project, we've decided that what we need to do is to focus on two demonstration possibilities as part of the trail to demonstrate, number one, that fundraising can be successful. New sources of funding can be identified to help us install those demonstration projects, and we can demonstrate once again to the community what a wonderful natural resource this is. So our consultant for the concept plan for the One Arroyo Trail has offered a couple of possibilities for demonstration projects. One is near Devil's Gate Dam and the 210 freeway, north and south of that area. And the other one is it's in the lower arroyo, and the boundary between the central arroyo and the lower arroyo underneath the Colorado Street Bridge. Slide. And because of time, we won't do more than simply point out two illustrations that will give you some idea what we hope to accomplish in this effort as it goes on, not over a month or not over a year, but over the future of the Arroyo Seco. This is the existing condition in that demonstration area that's near the 210 freeway, and the new slide will show the kind of reconfiguration and improvements that we anticipate as part of a rebuilt and completed trail. Similarly, in the lower demonstration project area, this is the existing condition, and this is the kind of vision that our consultant for the park plan has offered to us as to what it might be. Now, slide. This gets me to the completion of the easy part of tonight's presentation. I'm now going to turn the podium over to Doug Kranwinkle, who is going to talk about where the money comes from.
As always, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Steve, for hosting us tonight, and thank you, Mayfield, for having us here, and thank all of you for joining us. We're pleased to be talking with you. Bill discussed the vision statement that's been developed by the group and the projects and priorities that Tom Seifert and his group have worked together with the entire AAG, and the outreach we've had, which has been very extensive throughout the community. There's been pretty universal buy-in to the notion of this One Arroyo Trail being the beginning project on the Arroyo. When I say pretty universal, this is Pasadena. There's no universal. So it's pretty universal buy-in, and we're moving forward with it on that basis. The idea is that we have these 22 miles of trail within the Arroyo Seco now. In many places, they're not connected, and the signage is not good, and the footing is not good, and there are no places to sit and the like. So the thought is to improve the trail so it's something we can all be proud of and use in a way that is great for us now and on into the future for our children and grandchildren. Now, as Bill says, the third part is the hardest one. How does it get funded? Implementation hopefully will follow funding, but how does it get funded? Up till now, the Arroyo Seco has been 100% dependent upon the city's general fund for its financing. We don't receive money from the state or the county of any consequence for the Arroyo Seco. It has $90 million in approved projects over the years that have been unfunded and remain undone. The general fund can barely afford the current maintenance needs down there. If any of you went down into the Arroyo in June or July, you saw kind of a mess. There were downed trees, there was brush everywhere, and many people became concerned that it was a fire hazard. And the city manager, thank heavens, and Mr. Malloyan and others in the city saw to it that it was cleaned up, and it was cleaned up very well. But the budget is simply not good enough to deal with that on a continuing basis. So we need to do better. Our assignment, as Bill said, was to change the paradigm for the funding of the Arroyo Seco, this great asset we have that belongs to everybody in Pasadena, not just those of us who are lucky enough to live on the rim as I do. I live on one rim now. I'm moving to another rim in about a month with my wife, who's right over there. And we've looked at a variety of ways of funding it. There are some earned income possibilities. There are a number of people who use the Arroyo on a continuous basis, and they could pay increased rents. There are fees that could be increased for certain uses in the Arroyo. And there are possible parking fees, but none of these is really enough to do the job that needs to be done to make this the great asset that it really should be for Pasadena for years to come. We also believe there should be a volunteer effort. We're encouraging that. We'll work with, hopefully, the Arroyo Seco Foundation, Tom's other group, and other nonprofit entities that are concerned about the Arroyo to create a volunteer corp to help the city with maintenance in the Arroyo. But again, that is not the only thing that needs to be done. We need new sources of public and private financing to implement what needs to be done in the Arroyo. The next slide shows the potential for the demonstration projects that Bill talked about. And those are really pretty exciting demonstration projects. Both of them can be done. We thought originally they were $5 million each, but it's $5 million for the two projects, which is a lot of money, but it's not an enormous amount when you think of the good that could be done with those two demonstration projects. We are looking to two possible ways. One, $1 million of contributed income from people like you and me and others, and corporations and the like, with a $4 million public gap filler. The other, and hopefully the one we're aiming for, is $3 million of philanthropic money and a couple $1 million of public money. But we're talking about both public and private money. On the public side, it's going to come mostly from state and county funds. I don't think we're going to see a lot of money in Pasadena from this administration in Washington. But we should see some from the state and the county. When we did our survey of users of the Arroyo Seco, we had something like 2,700 respondents to that survey. And almost half of them were non-Pasadenans. These are people who use the Arroyo heavily. They walk around it, they run around it, they bike it, they hike it. It's really a regional asset. We own it. It's a Pasadena asset. We've been funding it, but it deserves funding by the county and the state as well as by the citizens of Pasadena. We think a more focused effort to get that funding is required. The city has a lot on its plate, and it hasn't done a really good job of obtaining grant money that is available under Measure A of the county, under Senate Bill 5 that is pending in the state Senate. We are suggesting, in fact, we have hired as part of our Arroyo Seco's group, our Arroyo Advisory Group, a fellow named Rick Gould. I don't know if Rick is here tonight. He lives in the district, and he is a former Parks Commissioner of Santa Clarita, a really good guy, a conservationist, good friend of a bunch of us, including Tom Seifert. And he's going to be helping us go after appropriate grant money from the county and the state government. We've been enormously helped by Senator Portantino, whose deputy is here tonight. I'm somewhere in the back. I talked to him earlier. There he is. They've been very helpful in introducing a new bill to make sure we are included within Senate Bill 5, which we were not originally. And that will be a big boost to us if we can get that. That's a $4 billion measure that will be on the ballot in June dealing with parks and waterways. So we qualify for it, and we should be included in it. And we thank you for that very much.
Send us support letters. Please support letters.
Yes, please support it. We also believe that private side funding is needed, and we are proposing to form a new limited purpose 501c3 entity to do that. It will coordinate with the city and with other Arroyo entities like the Arroyo Seco Foundation. It will, we hope, have the ability to make sure that the funds that are given to the Arroyo Fund are spent appropriately. People don't like to give money just to the city you pay enough in taxes. So when you make a donation, you want to make sure the money is spent properly. We're hoping that this 501c3 will have a contractual situation with the city, which will allow it to have some oversight as to how the money is spent. It will be accountable to you and I and the citizens of Pasadena, and it will have the flexibility ultimately to morph into something else. It could become a conservancy, like the Central Park Conservancy, or something else. Who knows? Initially, it's a very limited purpose entity, which will be dealing with this project that we're talking about tonight. We've started a fundraising assessment, which is going to be hitting the streets in the next week or so. Some of you may be contacted. I hope you'll respond and give us your thoughts as the best way this should be done. This entire approach, by the way, was approved by the council at its February 5th meeting. And the city's normal processes for approving the project and the various elements within the project, the trail, the benches, et cetera, will be going through the city's normal processes with open public meetings that will start, Bill, I believe, in April at the Recs and Parks Commission. And there'll be plenty of opportunity for people to weigh in on things they like and they don't like along the way. We hope you do. We expect that our final report will be delivered to the council in June. It will cover a number of subjects. It'll cover the trail and the financing opportunities. It'll cover the other projects that we have looked at and prioritized that Bill showed up on the screen earlier. We'll have some comment on coordination and governance within the Arroyo, and we'll have some guiding principles that we hope the council will adopt for future dealings within the Arroyo. There may be more, who knows, but that's where we are today. In any event, thanks for your attention, thanks for your support, and we hope to see more of you.
I know we have a busy agenda, but I wonder if we could have a question or two, Bill and Doug. And yes, sir.
What effect is the sediment removal at Devil's Gate Dam going to have on the part one of your project?
Doug, if you, I'm going to repeat the question, and then I can hand you the mic, I think. And the question was, what effect will the sediment removal project of the county at Hahamunga have on the work that you're doing?
The LA County proposal as it now exists will definitely have a negative impact on Hahamunga. That impact has been dramatically reduced by the very aggressive activism of the Arroyo Seco Foundation, both in advocacy and in court, so that that impact will be reduced from what it would be. Beyond that, we don't know exactly how we will have to accommodate or to react to what the county does in the next 5 years with respect to sediment removal. We know the sediment removal is absolutely essential, and so it's a matter of accommodating reality, recognizing that it's going to be less impactful than it could have been, and hopefully it will not be seriously detrimental to our effort.
So I think the question basically is concern about commercialization of the arroyo, and I guess some concern about the process of having a nonprofit work on proposals. I would say, Nina, that you said their meetings weren't open to the public. There were a number of outreach meetings that were open to the public. So
go to the AAG itself and listen to the discussions when they adopted that very long, detailed plan. Nobody.
let me ask Doug and Bill to respond.
Well, there really isn't any big detailed plan that's been adopted. I'm quite aware. There is the trail plan the trail consultants came up with, Nina, that was presented at the city council, and you saw that. None of the details within that plan have been adopted by the AAG. We approved the connected trail proposal, and we expect the other details to be worked through at the Recs and Parks Commission and other city commissions that have jurisdiction. We do not. Over those projects. We do not expect there to be a gigantic sign of donors within the arroyo. There will be some undoubtedly need for a donor recognition plaque of some sort. We hope it can be very modest. It may be one plaque. It may be small plaques in the ground like the Begley Trail in the northern part of the arroyo, or the eastern part, western part, where I live. But none of those decisions have been made or even really discussed at this point in time.
Yeah, and I would echo that, and don't forget the John Crowley Trail along Salvia Canyon there, which we dedicated a number of years ago properly and discreetly as well. So I think it's a fair point. I know Nina and others expressed concern about using the RBOC as the fiscal intermediary for the seed money that we're using with AAG. Again, healthy concern. The problem was if we went outside, there were nonprofits that might be available, but they would actually take a cut off the top for administrative fees. The Arroyo Seco the RBOC won't do that. The RBOC has dedicated a large amount of funds over the years to special projects in the Arroyo, so we'll keep an eye on that as well. So, okay, well, can we please thank Mayor Bogart and Doug Cranwinkle for all your work and for being here. Thank you. I also want to give some credit to Michelle Garrett from the city here who handled the slides so masterfully. And thank you, Michelle. And also Senator Portantino's aide is Dominic Corey, good friend of mine and a well-known presence at City Hall. And I think also in addition to SB 5, there's another piece of legislation that Anthony's trying to include the Arroyo in, and is that SB 1126, yes, Dominic? Okay, and we'll follow up with you and get more info about that, and then we'll perhaps do an email to remind people to send letters of support if in fact there is support there. So moving right along, I want to cover the two presentations from Mark Jomsky and Steve Mermel. I think I'll go in that order if it's okay. I'll ask Mark Jomsky to come up, and as we do that, just a little sort of brush up on municipal civics. Basically, the city council sets policy for the city, and we actually only have 3 employees at the city council level. I call them constitutional officers. It's not really the Constitution, it's the charter, but those 3 are the city manager, the city clerk, and the city attorney. And the charter allows for a 4th, which would be the city prosecutor, to handle criminal matters, but the council made a decision a number of years ago to combine the city attorney, the civil side, with the criminal side, so we only have the city attorney who handles both roles. So I'm delighted that we have 2 out of the 3 constitutional officers here tonight. And I was just going to, he took the words out of my mouth, that the 3rd is at a remote location, just in case something were to happen here. And But I'd like Mark to talk about a perhaps sort of subtle but very important work that Mark has been doing and the council's been doing that impacts the way we do municipal elections in Pasadena. So something very important to all of us. So let me introduce, he's a great city clerk. He's known in the city clerk world as being at the top of the heap. So please welcome Mark Chomsky, our clerk. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. My first district meeting, by the way, so I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much. So I'm here to talk about the future of Pasadena elections. As if you've been following the City Council, they've been over the last 6 months especially, but dating back to 2016, reviewing an issue that has come down from the state. I'm going to cover these topics, and really what's at heart is the city and school district are submitting a charter amendment to the voters. The city's charter amendment will change the timing of city elections, and the PUSD charter amendment will change the timing and format of PUSD elections, and the changes to align to statewide dates that are held in even years, your primary and your general election dates in even years. And we'll talk a little bit about the state's solution to low voter turnout elections. Their solution is called the California Voter Participation Rights Act. That was adopted in 2015. And then what this means for Pasadena elections, and I'll talk a little bit about this upcoming June 5th statewide primary election. So low voter turnout is a theme that when you talk about elections that's been common in the media. After a local election, you're likely to see a number of different headlines in the newspaper highlighting the turnout rates for the election. And for local elections, they tend to be lower in nature. If you look at Pasadena's local elections, the average city March election turnout is about 18.6 over the last 4 years. If you look at the average PUSD March election turnout, it's a little bit lower at 16.1%. You compare that to Pasadena's average turnout for the statewide primary, and that's 31.4%, almost double what we get for the March. And then if you compare it to the average statewide turnout for Pasadena for the general election, it's triple. It gets up to 63%. So the state was looking at these election, the state legislature was looking at these statewide election dates in even years, the gubernatorial and your presidential elections as the highest voter participation election dates. And so they came up with a bill called the California Voter Participation Rights Act. It's a mouthful. So we call it CVPRA to shorten it up. It was adopted and signed by Governor Brown in September 2015, and the premise is to move local elections where you have typically lower voter turnout to the high voter turnout statewide dates. And in essence, you're bringing the local races to when the voters come to the polls at higher rates. So some of the cities have been pushing back on this as a state, coming to the cities and telling them how to run elections, when to run elections. And so what does it mean if the cities were to ignore the CVPRA? Well, if you have a low voter turnout election, they wrote the law in such a way that a single voter in a city could go to court and sue the city to force the change to statewide dates. And they actually wrote into the law that if the city were to lose, they would then have to reimburse the plaintiff, the voter, attorney's fees and litigation expenses. So it makes it a very costly fight to have in this way. So as a charter city, Councilmember Madison spoke about that, we have adopted our own laws that are specific to Pasadena, and in them, one of the laws is when we set our own election dates. And we have that for the city of Pasadena, we also have that for the PUSD. So it was unclear as a charter city how CVPRA would, whether it was applicable to Pasadena and PUSD. So when we brought the issue to the council's attention in March of 2016, the city council wisely, I think, asked for clarification because we didn't want to unnecessarily have an upheaval of our election dates. We wanted to get a confirmation from the state attorney general to confirm that this would apply to charter cities. So we asked in March 2016, very timely, over a year later, we got a response from Attorney General Becerra, who issued opinion number 16603, that in fact found that CVPRA does apply to charter cities and to school districts whose timing is set by charter provision. I think it's safe to say if you watched that council meeting, there was some pushback from the council members. They feel that this is, again, one of those situations where the state is, again, impinging on local control and our rights. But we did contend with the question of how can the city and PUSD address the CVPRA legal issues and increase voter participation. And I think after looking at a lot of different issues, a lot of different alternatives, what we could do, and the answer pretty clearly came to to be consistent. The answer was to be consistent with the CVPRA, to transition to the statewide dates, to consolidate our elections with the Los Angeles County and have the Registrar of Voters run the elections on our behalf. The Registrar of Voters is the overall election official for the County of Los Angeles, which we fall in. So that ensures election integrity and accuracy for us. There is the benefit of increasing voter turnout. I think it's a benefit that the council embraces. That's one of the main reasons that they felt good about putting this forward to the voters. It is always better to get higher participation rates in local elections and to hear the voice of all Pasadena residents. And it does eliminate the issues, the legal issues and liabilities. So the city's proposed charter amendment will change dates. But we'll continue to utilize the primary and general election format that we currently use. So we have a March primary in odd years, and that will move to a March primary in even years. So for instance, the March 2019 will move to the March 2020. We have an April general election in odd years, just 6 weeks later. This is the big impact that I think the council had the hardest time with. The April 2019 will then move to November 2020 because that's the timing of statewide dates. But a successful candidate for city council, for mayor, for city council district race still requires a 50% plus one majority in either the March primary election or the November, and if it's not achieved in the March primary, then the top two candidates would go on to the general election. Only those two names would appear on the ballot. One of the other issues that we had to contend with, and there is no way to avoid it, is that the current terms of the incumbent council members are extended by 19 months. There's no way to go from the odd year elections to the even year elections without extending terms. Because the start of terms is May of odd years, it has to now move to December of even years after the November even year election. It's necessary on a one-time basis to make that transition. And again, we couldn't reduce terms this year, for instance, because we still have to make the change and then hold an election at the same time. That's not possible. It would be against the charter. For PUSD, their charter amendment, they actually are going to change dates, but also change format. They're going to change to single election plurality voting. So in that case, a candidate for PUSD will be elected by the highest number of votes cast for that race. So it's the most votes wins, and there would be no runoff. It helps them to save sort of the extra expense of having to run a runoff election if there were a need for a runoff. They're moving dates to the November statewide election to take advantage of that much higher participation rate on November dates. For the November gubernatorial and November presidential elections. And that'll be starting in 2020. Again, they need the extension of the 19 months to go from the May of odd year start of their terms to the November start of odd year terms to the November of even year, December of even years for the start of their terms. So at our special election, we called this special election, that was on February 15th. The council took action at the joint meeting of the city and PUSD to call a special election on June 5th. And we've just this Monday also called an election for two other ballot measures that I'm not the expert to talk about them, but I didn't want to not mention them. So we will have a total of 4 ballot measures coming up on this June 5th, 2018 statewide gubernatorial primary. It will be the city's charter amendment, the PUSD's charter amendment, and then as well, just on Monday, the city council called an election for a city ordinance measure that will allow a limited number of commercial cannabis businesses in Pasadena, and a city ordinance measure to impose a cannabis business tax to handle that. So with that, I wanted to give you a quick overview, and I'm available for questions. We have some contact information for my office, email, and the website where there's more information available.
Maybe before, if there are questions, let me just chime in here from the council perspective, at least my perspective. This is a mess, and it all started with a very well-intentioned state law that was intended to promote voter participation in all elections, really, but in municipal elections, most importantly for us. However, state law also says that if you are a charter city, and there are, I think, 105 charter cities in California out of 350, 400 cities, something like that. So, you're either a charter city or a general law city. So this state legislation immediately applied to all the general law cities, but there's a provision that says if you're a charter city, you really are supposed to be able to look after your own municipal interests yourself. And so there was a legal question which caused the request to be made to Javier Becerra, the Attorney General. Although importantly, he was the brand new Attorney General, and as you could see from that calendar, that request had been up in the office and had been worked on, I think, almost a year before.
It was initially made to Kamala Harris. She was at that time the Attorney General when we first made the request.
Right. Kamala Harris, who was then elected to the United States Senate, and then Javier was appointed. And, I think the staff dropped the ball. They looked at a precedent case that dealt with discrimination in local elections and found that when there were statewide remedies for discriminatory practices, those clearly would also apply to charter cities as well as general law cities, because the state has a compelling interest in rooting out discrimination and ridding our elective process of any sort of racial or ethnic discrimination. And that was correct. The current legislation, though, is intended to increase voter participation, period. It's just intended to get out the vote. And my view, and I think the view of the entire council, frankly, was that for charter cities, increasing voter participation within that city is primarily the interest of that city. And the council or the voters should be the ones to make that decision. But no matter, those arguments failed, and the Attorney General opined that this legislation applies to charter cities as well as general law cities. So we were faced with a dilemma: do we legally challenge the Attorney General's opinion, which I think would not have been a positive development. I think many would think that we were perhaps resisting something that was intended, for example, to prevent discrimination and the like. And after all, he is the Attorney General, and that was his opinion. And importantly also, I don't think there's a single charter city that has challenged the Attorney General the last time I checked.
I'll answer that.
Please.
I just actually got this call today. There is a city of Redondo Beach that is, but for political reasons, they're having a lot of, and I'll just to put it into context, they're having a lot of infighting on the council, and they may actually legally challenge the Secretary of State who authored the bill.
Ministry,
and
yeah.
Right, so there is that. I don't want that to, but that happened today.
But for the most part, all the cities are falling in line
Burbank.
with the Attorney General's direction. And so then the choice, so what that means, and again, sorry to get so granular on this, but it is important. So what it means is we're basically ordered now to have our municipal elections with the statewide and federal elections that happen in even years. And the problem with that is, as Mark showed, you're going to have a March primary and a November general election. And so I think that's a really bad thing because, for example, when we have our municipal elections, those who are interested in the municipal election are focused on the municipal election. There are no other races competing for press and attention And if fundraising is important for funds, also our city offices are nonpartisan, and I think that's really important. That's as it should be. Now we're going to be thrown in with partisan races in the statewide and federal elections, and so you're going to see slate mailers that are very partisan in nature, and candidates and incumbents are going to be attracted to jumping on board with those. So our choice was then, we're stuck with that March, November, even year plan. Now we can do one of two things to sort of alleviate that. We can do what the school district did, is just have one election and elect our officials by plurality. So that would mean, for example, if there was an open council seat, 5 candidates might run, and the top vote getter might get 22% in that primary election. That candidate would then be elected under plurality. That candidate would be elected to office. And I can just tell you, I've been through a number of elections, and the job's hard enough when you have 50% plus 1. The idea that if you only had the mandate of a quarter of the voters who voted. So then the other option is keep the primary and the general so that you have the primary first. Then if no candidate gets 50% plus 1, then in November you have the runoff of the top 2 candidates, and it'll be tough for those candidates who have to campaign for whatever that 7, 8, 9 months more, and it did require us to alter the nature of all of the terms on the council. But for us, I think we felt it was a rock and a hard place, and the lesser of two evils was to stick with the majority, 50% plus 1, 2 elections. Now, my hope is that the technology will catch up and we'll have instant runoff voting that will be available. Right now, it's not available, just in terms of vendors and the expense. And since we now, under this rule, we have to go through the county for our elections, they're not equipped to do that, but I'm hopeful that soon they will be. And then we can consider, and obviously I'd be interested in your opinion, too, is we can consider going to a one election where we actually just rank the candidates. And then we do have a runoff. It's just an instant runoff if nobody gets 50% plus 1 in the first vote. So appropriate that we're out of school, because this is a lot of sort of boring curriculum on municipal elections. But as I said, extremely important. And this is going to be on you before you know it. You're going to be asked to take a position on this initiative on the ballot. So Nina, yes.
What happens if people are angry?
So the question was, what happens if the charter amendment fails? Well, the first thing we talked about with the city attorney's office is that we would seek relief from the courts, that we have an opinion from the attorney general, and we would seek relief from the courts to be consistent with the law that we're trying to be consistent with. Sort of a backup to that, because that could take time, is we may come back to you in November to make a second charter amendment, because we would have to turn to the county to run our elections as standalone. Our election vendor, who has been running our elections for, I think it's almost 50 years, is now out of business. He's actually, I can say that out loud, he's sent an email to all the city clerks that are his clients, and he said, we're closing doors at the end of 2018. We will not be able to help with any future elections. So we'll have to turn to the county. They really are the only entity that would be able to handle our elections. And we could probably do that for 2019 and 2021 without potentially getting sued, because there's a grace period that we've adopted the proper resolutions, we've gone through the proper process, and we can potentially run elections in 2019 and 2021. However, the downside to that is the county is charging 3 times as much. They gave us a quote for our elections that cost, where we would normally cost about $765,000 to run 2 elections. Their quote was $2.1 million. So it's not an ideal option for us. This is why, again, we were and we went through this, and we studied how to bring in elections, and potentially to bring in elections in-house, and for me to run elections and be my own county elections official. The city of Long Beach actually did that. They are now switching to statewide dates. I think there's a lesson in there somewhere. And we would still be contending likely with low voter turnout issues. I think we have to look at that issue of 20% turnout versus 60% turnout. It's a real issue. So I agree with Councilmember Madison. I agree with the council. It was not an easy decision. It is a rock and a hard place situation. But we do have a plan in case something happens. But we're hoping that this moves forward properly.
And, when we talk about 20 versus 60, yeah, maybe 60% will vote in the general election, but this will be a down ballot, local issue, and not everybody that votes fills out all the boxes, And I know Anthony had floated legislation to move us up to the top of the ballot. And
I've put that up because
Yeah.
I was anticipating that one as well. Try to be prepared. So there's new state legislation that Senate Bill 25 by Senator Portantino, who's trying to work through a change in the ballot ordering so that it reorders the offices on the ballot so that local races now that are being compelled to move the statewide dates and having to contend with all of these races, they are actually at the top of the ballot. So you would get your local races first, your school district races second, county, statewide, and then national races. The more well-funded are farther down the ballot because they're more well-funded. So that's actually making its way through the process. We actually sent a letter of support, and I've asked some of my city clerks out there to ask their councils to do the same thing. And we're going to ask Dean Logan, who's the county registrar, to also maybe weigh in. But yeah, there is this possibility that we can flip the order of the ballot and hopefully not have such a big impact to local races with this down ballot issue. The other thing I would say is that I'm going to be working hard to try and make sure that Pasadena voters are aware and are able to vote in their local election. So things like having our own sample ballot pamphlet and making sure that we are doing more outreach now that I'm not having to run the actual nuts and bolts of the election, but making sure that the voters are aware and how to get to voting places and things of that nature. I feel that would be my next real challenge and focus as we work through this. So I will be working on that.
So other questions about our dizzying election? Bruce?
Is there anything that would say that 100% write-in ballots would improve the percentage of people who vote and save you money?
I don't understand.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what you mean.
Everybody would do a write-in. Be the only way you vote.
Yeah,
Are you talking about mail-in ballots?
Mail-in ballot.
mail-in, not,
Yeah, not write-in.
right, okay. If everyone
Mail-in ballot.
did mail, well, we basically have that for anyone that wants it,
They're all
but,
mail-in ballots. You can
Yeah.
always sign up to be a permanent vote-by-mail voter. And there's also, I don't want to get too far ahead of it, but there's also going to be changes in the election process starting in 2020 by the Los Angeles County Registrar. The option of vote-by-mail ballot will be even more increased. There's going to be more of these voting centers where they'll be open for an extended period of time. We're talking 10 days, one location. You can go, and they've also had it set up, are going to set it up so that if you go to a voting location, let's say in Cerritos, you can still pick up your Pasadena ballot. So where you go to these voting centers throughout the county, you can still get your Pasadena ballot and vote your Pasadena ballot. They will still be paper ballots. So they're working through a new voting system. They're getting that certified through the Secretary of State's office, and that is something that's coming in 2020. But the vote-by-mail balloting is going to be a new feature in upcoming elections as well.
yes.
I was just going to reiterate what she just said. If we vote no on.
So the question is about the cannabis initiatives, and let me just say a word or two about that. First of all, terrible public policy, that we, as a state, that we legalize marijuana. This is my opinion as the father of a 20 and a 21-year-old. I tell them all the time, you go over to Caltech and those 30 or 40 Nobel Prize winners, they weren't sitting around getting high, believe me. So terrible public policy, but it's the law, state law. And the reason that we put an initiative on the ballot is that the industry is putting an initiative on the ballot that is much more permissive. So we're forced to allow this now because of the statewide initiative in Pasadena, but we're allowed to have reasonable zoning code and the like regulations. So we can't ban it. We have to permit it, but we can have some reasonable regulations. So what we did on Monday evening, or as Bill joked, truthfully, it was actually Tuesday morning because we went till 1 a.m. on this. We put on the ballot an initiative that allows for very limited cannabis locations, both cultivation and retail, which is what you have to do. As an aside, I actually tried to stop it based on edibles. I think about half of the business is now edible cannabis, which comes in the form of, brownies, cakes, donuts, cookies, even gummy bears. And I have a real concern, if a 12-year-old is smoking marijuana, I think you're more likely to find that out than if he or she is eating gummy bears that have cannabis. But my colleagues would not go along with that idea that we permit no edibles. By the way, we could do that under the statewide law. We could say we'll allow cannabis but no edible, nothing like candy or cookies or cakes or what have you. So if you vote no, my fear is that there will be enough yes votes on the industry initiative, and then we'll be stuck with sort of unlimited locations. As it is now, we set a maximum of 6, and I believe we kept the 1 per council district. And we also imposed a pretty stringent limitation in terms of how close you can be to a residence. 600 feet from any residence. And when you think about it, a lot of the multifamily development that we've had in the center part of the city in particular, if you look at the map, there are really only a couple of places where you could site a business. They're pretty much high rent areas. And again, with the 1 per council district limitation, hopefully we'll only have 1 or 2, but I don't know what the economics of it will turn out to be. Yeah. Is you going to cover some of that? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, Steve has an outline of the regulations that we adopted. But so reluctantly, I would urge you to vote yes on the city initiative so that we don't get the industry one. And I'll tell you, there were, 40, 50 people there to argue in favor of sort of unbridled permissiveness when it comes to this. So, Nina.
The first
Oh, hold on one second. Did I answer your question? I want to, yeah, okay, thank you.
apparently, and this was unclear Monday night,
We received a notice of intention to circulate a petition in December of an initiative measure. That's what was defeated was a referendum on an ordinance that the council passed. So they passed an ordinance. This group collected, I think it was something like 9,400 signatures. They needed 8,570 or something to that effect to have it successfully referend, meaning stop the ordinance. They weren't able to get that done. So the council's prohibition to ban commercial marijuana went into effect. They, the very next week, filed the notice of intention to circulate a separate initiative petition, which is a separate process. This is where they proposed their own ordinance with their own regulations, which are, as Councilmember Madison stated, much more permissive. And so that is now currently out in the community, and they're gathering signatures. Now, this group has shown a ability to gather signatures in a very short time. They were able to referend an earlier ordinance where the council adopted regulations to shut off utilities. It was called the Utilities Shut-Off Ordinance. And they gathered something to the effect of 13,000 signatures in less than 30 days. And they were able to turn that in, and they were successful. They got enough signatures, enough of those were valid to stop the city's ordinance on that and suspend it. So they have means, and they have the ability, and they have demonstrated the ability to be successful in these types of election efforts. So I think I think that didn't get exactly answered on Monday night, and I wanted to answer that for you now. So yes, there currently is an initiative petition where they are out and they are able to collect enough signatures, and they could get it on the November ballot. That's what we were concerned about, and then their regulations would be put in front of the voters, and potentially that would be what we would have to live with.
And their regulations are very permissive.
Very permissive.
And their efforts are statewide industry funded. They're very well funded,
Correct.
right?
And the one thing I would say is the illegal operators that are out in the city right now in this initiative effort, they would be grandfathered in and they would be allowed to continue to operate. And so there would be
But in
more.
ours, they're forbidden.
In ours, they're forbidden. But with this initiative, they would be they were trying to give themselves the rights to operate.
This is going to be all very hard to explain,
Yeah.
isn't it? Because this is on the ballot, the city's on June, and we're really working to everyone to understand.
In the voter information pamphlet, there's going to be a city attorney's impartial analysis of our measure. There'll be arguments written by the council members, because the council designated themselves to explain our ordinance and to put forward our messaging. And I assume that there'll be some political activity committee to help sort of promote what this means.
Yeah, it really goes down hard with me because if you read the language, and we talked about this on Monday, it says, the city hereby resolves to rescind the ban on commercial marijuana and have commercial marijuana. I mean, it almost looks like, if you didn't know the background, that the city council is promoting this, but it's really what was described. So, Diane.
What will be the process for selecting the 6 vendors?
It's probably a question
Yeah, I
for
think
Steve.
I'll-
Yeah. Let me, I'm just concerned because the school needs to clean this room. I think they have some people waiting over, and we told them we'd be out by 8. So let me get to Steve Mermel. He'll cover that question, Diane. And then,
later if they.
okay, great. Yep. Okay, so Steve Mermel is the city manager, the CEO of the city's operation, and I'll throw it to him to talk about finances and the other issues. Thank you, Steve.
To respond to that question, it's not a first come, first serve on the 6 vendors. It'll be a qualifications-based process that myself and other key staff members, I may invite some members of the community to participate in that. We want to get good operators that have a successful business plan that are going to operate in an above-board fashion. So, I apologize to everybody. I have a cold. I normally have a nasally twang. It's a lot more nasally this evening. I apologize for that. I'll try to be merciful. I only have a few slides. Councilmember Madison asked me to talk about the city's fiscal outlook, so that's what I'll do. The city's budget, when we think of the city's budget, we usually talk about the general fund. That's the fund that pays for most city services, including the nice police and fire people in the back of the room. Wave, you're paying their salaries, and mine too. Thank you. As is normally the case, most of the city dollars go to police and fire protection. You can see on the pie chart here, the police budget, a little more than $71 million, and the fire department budget just under $45 million, but they're working hard to increase their pie. Public Works is the next biggie there, $21 million, and then you add everybody else up, and that's the remainder. What's not shown on here is debt service payments. This is just what we're spending on our operating budget. This chart here is our 5-year financial forecast. We've been using this for about 20 years to map our expenses and our revenues and to tell us, are we on the right track or the wrong track, right? You're either making money, you're either bringing in more than you're spending, or you're spending more than you're bringing in. That's the way things work, right? So red generally is bad. And what we can see here is if we look at the third column in from the left where it says fiscal year 2018, that's the year we're currently in. And there's a line item towards the bottom right here, operating income. And the number for 2018 is just a little tiny $75,000. So that's what we anticipated when we adopted the budget. That's a hair's breadth, right? Considering our general fund budget's about $240 some odd million. Now we tend to be conservative, but our trends show this is where we are. We're reaching a point, and we've been here a couple of times in the past. Right before the recession hit, it was the same thing. We were spending more than we were bringing in. So our current projections suggests that next year, which begins July 1, if we don't make a course correction, we'll spend $3.5 million more than we bring in. And it gets a little bit worse every year after that. Now, the city does have reserves. In fact, we've increased our reserves to 20% of our total budget. And that's the policy amount that the city council has established. You need reserves because there's going to be another recession. There's going to be a natural disaster. You need to have reserves. But you don't want to dip into your reserves every month because you can only do that for so long and then you have no reserves. So this is the issue that we're struggling with. This is really just those numbers in a visual format because people sometimes like to see it displayed this way. The red are our total expenditures, the blue are our total revenues, and our trend line is such that we're beginning to spend more than we're bringing in. You might ask about the little mountain range there during fiscal 16, 17. We got an infusion of about $9 million, which under most cases would be great. The problem is it's $9 million from litigation we had with the state. We felt we were owed $40 million. So the $9 million was really kind of a consolation prize. That ties back to debt that the city issued many years ago, which, by the way, that debt didn't go away. So we were relying on the 40 to pay the debt. We only got 9. So it looks nice in the chart, but when you understand the backstory, it was very disappointing to us. That all relates to the elimination of redevelopment that the governor did a few years ago. This chart shows our money in the bank, if you will, our savings account. There's 2 lines. The darker, kind of the mountain range in the back, is money that we have over and above what our reserve policy was. And then the mountain range in the front is where our policy has been. And as you can see, the mountain range in the front has gotten bigger as we move out in future years because the city council quite wisely raised our reserve percentage. And so we now have about a 20% reserve. The little red line coming off the far right there is where our reserve ought to be as we go out into the future. Because we're projecting that we're going to spend more than we're bringing in, that space is created because that's us dipping into our savings to balance our budget if we don't do something different. So despite the significant cost reductions we've made in recent years, we've eliminated $19 million of ongoing expenditures in the general fund. We eliminated 123 staff positions, 23 of which were police positions. And we shifted to our employees. There's been a lot in the newspaper about CalPERS, pension benefits, and something has to give there. The challenge is, though, that these were promises made to people a long time ago, and the liabilities have to be paid. You can't escape these liabilities. But we've shifted $5 million of those annual liabilities to employees. Employees are paying their portion, and they're paying some of the city's portion, which I think is only fair because they will benefit from the retirement system. So those are cuts we've made. Also, we have challenges with our key infrastructure. As Southern California cities go, we are a little older, a little grayer than others. Our fire stations are in significant need of upgrades. It rained on Monday. I got emails that our station is leaking. Our fire station shouldn't leak. That's the place you go to get the sandbags for your house. We don't need them in our station, right? Many of them were built mid-century is the nice way to say it. They need to be rehabilitated. And we've done that with a couple of them, but we have 5 more to go. Our streets, our sidewalks need repair. We have beautiful tree canopy, but what does it do? It uplifts the sidewalk. We have about 900,000 square feet of sidewalk that needs to be replaced. Our current estimated cost for that exceeds $12 million. We don't have that money to do that. And we need to replace the radios that our police and fire people are carrying. The radios they carry are good for about 10 years. How old are your radios? They're 10 years old. Brian said 15. They're 10 years old. They need to be replaced. That's about $8 million. Again, we haven't identified the funding for that. And of course, demand for services never stops. Councilmember Madison, I hear him remark sometimes, people never ask for fewer services. And I think he's absolutely right. And when we look at what's going on in our city, we have a significant need for services. Think back 10 years ago. Was homelessness really a problem 10 years ago? Not really. But think about it now. We were driving around, Taka and myself and Mr. Madison were driving around town today. Quite a lot of homeless people. The city devotes an awful lot of resources to dealing with homeless people. We need even more resources, so that's a demand for services. As our community gets older, we're going to need to add another rescue ambulance to make sure that we can get to you within 6 minutes if you have a medical emergency, and other demands for medical services. And of course, programs for youth, diversion programs, keep kids out of trouble are important. As we move forward with next year's budget, as I mentioned, I have about a $3.5 million gap to cover. That's why I'm grateful Mark didn't triple our election budget by going with the county. But we still have to crack this $3.5 million net, and it's getting harder and harder every year as we trim and trim and trim. I expect we'll eliminate additional positions. This may be the year that we have to eliminate some sworn but vacant police positions, some positions in the fire department, because you remember what big slice of the pie that they were. It's hard to squeeze out of the other slices. And we're at the point where the public's going to start to notice the service reduction. We've been able to do a lot of belt tightening without people noticing it, but at a certain point, you notice it. So at the mayor's State of the City speech in January, he framed this issue, discussed that we're really at this point where we might want to consider seeking voter approval for additional revenues. It's really a conversation about what's the right level of city services? What services do you want? I think that one of the challenges, people want to have their cake and eat it too. My dad would say I had a champagne taste and a beer budget. I think you all understand what I'm saying. We need to maintain our services if that's what the community wants, but we also really have to reinvest in our infrastructure. And it was also suggested that if we were to go to the voters and ask them to approve some sort of a revenue measure, we might want to ask the voters to think about an advisory measure, separate measure that doesn't tie the council's hands, but just ask the voters, would you want to dedicate some of the revenue, assuming we did it, to help out the local school district? PUSD is struggling mightily. I've had a lot of conversations with people. There's a lot of different opinions around that. But they are definitely in a bad place financially. So we presented to the council January 29th, and I'll be back there Monday night. It will be a lot longer than this, but basically that's the thrust of it. And that's, I think, oh, here we go. And then as we develop the FY19 budget, we plan to do some further engagement with the community, so we would love to see you. Last year we tried some community engagement. We had 3 meetings, and in total we got about 20 people. That's not that great. So we're going to try it a little bit different this year to talk a little bit more about the services that people are most interested in rather than just the bland, boring budget presentation like I just made you sit through. And there it is. Thank you.
So when the mayor's sales tax proposal came to the council, there was a mix of reactions, candidly, and we asked the staff to go back and come back to us with some options about revenue, not just a particular sales tax that would be structured the way the mayor's concept was, but possibly other revenue mechanisms as well. So we still have some ways to go on that. So let me start back there and then I'll come up. Yes. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
My name's Mary Ann, and I came tonight because I think, can we just raise a hand?
Thank you. And I know some of you are from other parts of the city and came here tonight, and you're welcome. And I think it's important that you let your council member know that as well. I think if we had time to present on the burglary statistics, they sort of wax and wane, but the statistics certainly would not indicate that we're in a particularly terrible place. Now, any one burglary is a terrible position for a neighbor to be in. So in terms of the closing of California, that has been the plan for many years, that St. John and Pasadena Avenue would be taken back to residential streets. Having said that, many miles before we sleep in terms of that decision. If that is actually what is planned, there'll be much outreach. Steve, maybe you could address that.
And if you want, I'd like to speak to that.
On that, because we have the 710, that was just dead, what, a couple of years ago, and we haven't even seen.
So let me provide a little context on the bigger picture as it relates to potential closure of California and some of those other things. So with the Measure R money, and if the tunnel option is off the table, there's a large pot of money, $780 million or so, that's available for projects, okay? And in order to, we want some of that money to help improve mobility in our community. To get that money, we needed to submit a list of projects. They are not projects that have gone through environmental clearance. They are not fully baked, but you have to say, look, we've got stuff, and by submitting, we're saying Pasadena doesn't want to be ignored. We want to get that money to improve mobility in our corridors near the stub. So instead of looking at it like, oh my gosh, they're going to close California, as the council member indicates, we're very, very far from that. It's really our way of telling Metro, look, we have an expectation, we have a number of projects, and we want our fair share of that money. And we'll go through a process like it always does in Pasadena, but that's really the upshot of that, to make sure that we're in line, hopefully the front of the line, to get the mitigation dollars.
Taka? Yeah, I mean, Nina, excuse me, and then we had someone else over real quick.
As an advocate of participation, public participation, I think we should note, and let's go back, for 10 or 15 years, this has been previously.
And we had a session at City Council recently where we talked about what are still really just the beginnings of plans. So there'll be plenty of time. The fire department, I'm sure, is going to weigh in if there's anything unsafe about any of the plans. And so I want to make sure I get your question.
I know we're short on time.
Yeah.
My name is Ruth, and this really is a question I think for you, Steve, and Marianne touched on it a little bit in her comments. But when I think about
Steve,
I know it's a
yeah.
big issue, and I'm not as
No,
versed,
it's,
but I wanted to voice it.
these are what we talk about at City Hall, and I think one observation would be, so we're going to increase the sales tax when we have so many business storefronts that are vacant, I think the other thing is the notion that we have residential development, which is really what most of our development is, because people want to live here, and property owners have private property rights to develop within the code their property. Those may not contribute as much as you would think to the city's revenue. We get some building fees, and we get residential impact fees for recreational use. We get in lieu fees for affordable housing, which hopefully helps the homeless. But by and large, what we're trying to do with those new residents is grow the economy and invigorate the city economically. But Steve, you should
Right, let me just
respond to-
briefly touch on that. As Councilmember indicates, when a new development comes in and people say, well, the city brings in development, we really don't. People want to build here, they want to develop here. What the council does control is land use and zoning, and we say how big and what and where. But beyond those very broad brushes, it's really private activity. We do charge pretty high impact fees as people come in the door, but once something is built, particularly if it's a residential project, really all we see off of that is property tax revenue. We get 21% of the 1%. So if it's $1 million condo, the 21% of the 1% is, someone do the math, not a whole huge amount. And of course, those new residents are going to need fire service and police officers, so there's a cost. So a lot of cities tend to want to shy away from residential because it costs to provide services, and you want to have, or at least you want to have a good balance of commercial and residential, right? So then you say, well, we see vacant buildings. I remember when Robinson's closed. I've been here 29 years in the city. And it was so long before we got to Target, and we were very happy to get Target. The city does not control private property. It's a shame that the Borders building on South Lake is still vacant. I can't tell you how many times the city staff that work for me in economic development bring a would-be tenant to a would-be landlord. But in the end, they have to consummate a deal. We can't make that happen for them. And because rents are high in Pasadena, some landlords who've owned property a long, long time, and so they can sit on it vacant. The clerk and I used to like to go to 800 Degrees, nice pizza place right there, Fair Oaks in Colorado. They're not there anymore. Landlord feels he could charge higher rent, and they're out. We hustle every day to try to bring people into town, but it's still ultimately a private party deal. And I'm happy to talk to anybody more about that later. It's fascinating.
And we are approaching closing. I do want to mention, going back to the public safety issues, both our police chief and our fire chief, Phil Sanchez, Bertrell Washington, are here. I want to give them a shout out, first of all. Thank you for all that you do. I would recommend that you chat with them about your concerns, and they'll have information that I think is helpful. I also want to thank the fire chief, by extension, all the firefighters. We had firefighters up in Santa Barbara at those fires, and that was quite a thing. So thank you. Okay, we'll stick around for a little bit. Thank you all very much for being here tonight, and thanks to our guests.